Welcome, uh,
Thanks.
the man, the myth, the legend, the super communicator, Charles Duhigg. How
Thank
would
you for
you?
having me.
Yes. How would you actually introduce yourself?
I'm Charles Duhigg, the author of Supercommunicators and previously The Power of Habit. And I'm a writer at the New Yorker magazine and an author of books.
Thank you. And I have super communicators. I got notes, man. I've taken
Oh,
a lot of
good.
notes, done a lot of highlighting here. Let's just start with saying what is a super communicator?
Well, okay, so let me start by asking you a question, which is if you were having a bad day at work and you wanted to call someone who you know would make you feel better, does the person you would call, do they pop into your mind? Do you know who that is?
Yes. Yes, I
Yeah?
do. I mean,
Who's one of
there's
them?
so many. One of them would be Charla Freeland, who's on this call right now.
Okay.
She's watching and listening.
So Charla for you is a super communicator, and you're probably a super communicator back to her, right? You know what questions to ask and how to ask them that draws out what's really going on. You know how to show her that you're listening to her, that you're paying attention. You know that sometimes she might be complaining about something and she doesn't need advice. She just needs empathy.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is... Yeah?
like emojis or memes and GIFs.
Yes, there's all types of different ways of communicating. Now, what's interesting is if we were to look at what you do with Charla and Charla does with you, what we would see is a set of skills. And you might not think of them as skills. You might think of them as intuition, that this is just how you talk to Charla. But once you recognize those as skills, then you can start applying them to your conversations with other people. We are all super communicators at one point or another. We all know what to say to a friend. We all know that feeling when you walk into a meeting and you know exactly what to say to get everyone on your side. But there are some people who are consistent super communicators who can connect with anyone. And it's not because they're more outgoing. It's not because they're born with the gift of gab. It's because they recognize that what they do with their friends is a set of skills, and they can use those skills on coworkers or strangers or anyone that they want.
Okay, I like that. So in a way, we are all super communicators to some extent, but there are ways to flex that muscle in more areas than we think.
That's exactly right. There's a way to flex that muscle every time we open our mouth, if we want to, right? If we want to connect with someone.
Okay.
And the reason why is because if you think about it, communication is Homo sapiens' superpower. Right? It is the reason why our species has succeeded so well. And as a result, our brains have adapted to be very, very good at communication. But sometimes we have to recognize what makes us good at communication and then just practice it a little bit until it becomes a habit.
Okay. So first of all, let's back up a second because I want to know why you wrote this book.
Sure.
Can you tell us why? Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. So this started when I got into this bad habit with my wife, which is that I would come home from work and I'd start complaining about my day. You know, like my boss doesn't appreciate me or my coworkers don't realize what a genius I am. and my wife very reasonably would give me some good advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better? And instead of being able to hear her advice, I would get even more upset. And I would say like, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side. She would get upset that I was attacking her. So is this familiar to you at all? This is something...
Yeah, I mean, I think you're giving something and you're hoping for something else in return and you're not getting what you were expecting or wishing for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this happens in relationships all the time, right? Where one person mentions a problem and the other person tries to solve it and they don't want a solution. They want empathy.
Right.
So I went to these researchers and I said, like, look, I'm a professional communicator. Why do I keep making this same mistake? And they said, well, we're glad you showed up because we're actually living through this golden age of understanding communication. For really the first time, we can see what's happening inside people's brains as they talk to each other. And one of the big things that we've learned is that when you have a discussion, you assume you know what that discussion is about, right? We're talking about my day or, where to go to dinner or the kids' grades. But they said, if we look at your brain while you're having that discussion, actually you are having multiple different kinds of conversations all within that discussion.
How so?
Well, in general, our conversations fall into one of three categories, right? There's these practical conversations where we're trying to solve problems or make plans together. But then there's emotional conversations where I tell you what I'm feeling and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize.
Right.
And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other in society, the identities that are important to us. And what the researchers said is they've said, look, all three of these conversations are important and all three of them are legitimate. And all three will probably happen during any one discussion. You'll move from emotional to social to practical back to emotional together. But if you and the person you're talking to are not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, then you cannot hear each other fully. You can't feel connected to each other. And this has become known as the matching principle in psychology. And what it says is that successful communication requires having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. And one of the goals of communication is for you and me to start thinking alike. This is known within neuroscience as neural entrainment. And what we know is that as we're having a good conversation, our bodies and our brains start to match each other. Without us realizing it, on this call, our breath patterns have started to match each other. Our heart rates have started to match each other.
What?
Yeah, even the dilation of our pupils are starting to align. But most importantly, what's happening inside our brains is becoming more and more similar, which makes sense when you think about it. Because if I tell you about an emotion I'm feeling, you actually feel that emotion a little bit, right? Or if I
we're
tell
on
you
the
about
same
an idea,
wavelength.
Exactly. And when we're on that same wavelength, when we achieve neural entrainment, is when we start to feel connected, when we can completely hear each other. That's actually the goal of communication, is this pro-social instinct for neural entrainment. Now, the thing is, if I'm using my prefrontal cortex because I'm having a practical conversation, and you're having an emotional conversation, and you're using your amygdala and your basal ganglia, the parts of your brain that are deep in the interior, it's hard for us to start thinking alike, right? Because we're using different parts of our brain. That's why the matching principle is so important, is because when I match you or I invite you to match me, our brains become aligned. And at that moment, not only, even if we disagree with each other, we'll feel more connected. And more importantly, we can hear each other much more clearly.
Could you give me an example of that? So like, how does one go, okay, like you're having a practical conversation, or you think you are, and I'm coming at you hot with some emotional conversation, or maybe just like, I'm emotional. Can you give me an example? Like, how do we bridge that gap? How do we bridge that divide?
Yeah, so I'll tell you how they teach teachers to do it. They go to it, they say, look, if a student wants to have a serious conversation with you, the first thing you should do is ask them, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard? Which is the practical, the emotional, and the social. And anyone who's listening who has kids at home, if you ask them that in a conversation, they will tell you exactly what they want, right? They know what they need.
Right.
Now, in the workplace or with adults, it's a little harder to say, do you want to be helped, hugged, or heard, right? So what we do is we can ask and my wife does this with me all the time. She says, look, I hear you complaining about work. Do you want me to help you come up with solutions for this? Or do you just need to like get it off your chest and unload, right? It's what she's really asking is, do you want to have a practical conversation or an emotional conversation? And usually I say like, no, we don't have to come up with solutions. I'm just super frustrated. I need to like have someone hear how frustrated I am.
Right. So but I'll take a hug.
Exactly. In a conversation, we can ask.
Right.
Now, the other thing, though, is that sometimes it's hard to ask or it's awkward. So there's another technique for figuring out what kind of conversation is happening and get aligned, which is to ask questions. One of the things that we know about consistent supercommunicators is that they ask 10 to 12 times as many questions as the average person. And some of those
sounds
questions—
like a journalist.
Exactly. Journalists are, it's that skill that we develop, because asking questions can feel kind of hard at first, right? But some of the questions that people ask are just questions that we hardly even register as questions, like, to invite us into a conversation. Oh, what'd you think about that? Or, oh, that's interesting. What'd you say next?
Right. You talk about how conversations there are certain prompts that you can use these are basically invitations. Right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And the best invitation is what's known as a deep question, something that asks someone about their values or their beliefs or their experiences.
And some shallow questions, which is sort of, we throw these around as small talk, and sometimes we sort of toss, small talk. But you make the argument that small talk can also be deep questions. Like shallow questions can be deep questions, depending on how you ask them.
Absolutely. So here's a good example. Let's say you're at a party and you bump into someone, you say, oh, what do you do for a living? And they say, oh, I'm a doctor, right? The easiest thing to ask would be a shallow question. Oh, what hospital do you work at? Right? But that's like a total non-starter. It's a one-word answer. Right. So instead you could just say, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Now that question That question asks that person to talk about their experiences. It asks them to talk about their values, what they get out of being a doctor, why they enjoy it so much. That's a question that invites them to say something real and meaningful. And in any setting, we can ask a deep question. It's just a matter of oftentimes, instead of asking people about the facts of their life, asking them how they feel about their life.
I like that. I like that approach. Some people might be a little turned off by that, right? And some people might be like, oh, I mean, because sometimes the why questions can make people feel uncomfortable. But it sounds like this is sort of like part of the experiment, right? That you're suggesting.
Yeah, well, I think that you'd be surprised. So one of the things we know, and this is from a guy named Nick Epley at the University of Chicago, people tend to assume that others will react to questions way worse than they actually do, right? He does this experiment that I've done myself from stages when I give speeches of asking the audience to turn to the person next to them and ask and answer one question, which is, when is the last time you cried in front of another person? And before they do the question, he asks them, just anticipate how awkward you think this is going to be. Like, is this going to be fun or terrible? And everyone thinks it's going to be terrible. And then they do it and they love it. They love that conversation, right? They get to know someone.
Right.
So very often, if you ask someone, why did you become a doctor? Maybe they're in a bad mood. Maybe they don't want to make small talk, but they're at a party, right? Like they're probably social to begin with.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to mind answering that question. And in fact, you're going to find that it's a real conversation.
Okay. All right. I like this. I'm all for experimenting, and I'm all for like just like put it out there, dig a little deeper. But how can somebody hone that craft, hone that sort of that approach? Yeah.
And this is just the first skill, right? Is asking deep questions. The number one way is just to practice it. One of the things that we know about how our brains have evolved is that we tend to make communication habits. We tend to form communication habits very quickly. And so if you practice something just 1 or 2 or 3 times, it'll become a habit very, very speedily. So how do we do this? Honestly, a big part of it is just saying, tomorrow morning, I'm going to ask one person a deep question, right? They might not recognize it as a deep question, but when I get on the bus, I'm going to turn to the person next to me and I'm going to say like, hey, I'm Charles. What do you do for a living? And they're going to say, oh, I'm an accountant. And I'm going to say, oh, did you always want to be an accountant? Is that what you dreamed of being as a kid? Now they're probably going to say, no kid dreams of being an accountant, right? I wanted to be an astronaut. But the point is that by asking that question, you're starting a real conversation. So if people just practice, just set a goal of once a day asking a deep question where they might not have, what they'll find is by the end of the week, they're doing it automatically.
Right. I like that. Okay. I don't take public transportation often, but I do talk to strangers all the time. It's just sort of the hazard of working from home. It's like once I'm out, I'm unstoppable, Charles. I feel like we're living also in a time of some like serious misinformation and disinformation. And a lot of people are, and maybe in some ways, weaponizing supercommunication. And I would love to know what you think of that, because so much of that social identity is tied to like what a lot of these conversations end up sort of erupting, right? And so, I mean, what do you say to that?
Well, so what I would say is, it's important to understand what the goal of a conversation is, right? If your goal of a conversation is to say, I know the truth and you're under some delusion, and I want to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong. First of all, you're unlikely to be successful. But second of all, that's not really a conversation, right?
You're condescending.
You're condescending. You're monologuing. You're not really listening. You're pretending to listen while you wait your turn to speak. And so what's really important in those situations is to understand, what's my goal of a conversation? And the goal of a conversation is not to convince the other person that you're smart, that you're right, that they should trust you. The goal of a conversation is simply to listen to them closely enough that you understand what they are saying to you, and to speak in such a way that they can understand and hear you in return. And if you walk away genuinely understanding each other, then even if you disagree with each other, even if you're going to vote for different people, even if I think that the government's great and you think it's run by lizard people, as long as we actually understand each other and we believe that we understand each other, we believe that the other person is listening, we will feel more of a sense of connection. We will feel more of a sense of trust. And we can use that connection and trust over time to really come to a consensus.
How?
Well, there's actually a technique for this.
Okay, let's hear it.
Yeah. So there's a technique known as looping for understanding that they teach at Harvard and Stanford and all these other fancy places. And what it recognizes is that oftentimes when I'm listening to you, simply listening isn't enough. I also have to prove to you that I'm listening to you, because otherwise there's that suspicion that you're not listening. You're just waiting your turn to talk. And so the way that we do this is this 3-step process, looping for understanding. The first step is ask a question, preferably a deep question, right? Then when you answer the question, step 2, I'm going to repeat back what I heard you say in my own words. And the goal here is not mimicry. The goal here is to prove to you that I'm actually paying attention, to prove to you that I'm processing this, right? That I'm thinking about it. And most people do this intuitively, step 1 and step 2. It's step 3 that I always forget to do, which is once I've repeated back what I heard you say, ask if I got it right. You know, did I hear you correctly? Because what is happening in that moment is that I am asking you for permission to acknowledge that I was listening. And what we know is that if you acknowledge that I was listening, you become much more likely to listen to me in return.
I think a lot of us don't do step 3.
Yeah.
We see it play out. On TV, it plays out. It's like sort of as entertainment too, which is like not a good thing, but we see it. We sort of see it everywhere, right?
And step 2, sometimes I think we fall down on, right? Where somebody tells us something interesting and we don't ask any follow-up questions. We don't share anything about ourselves. We don't say, what I hear you saying, tell me if I'm getting this right, right? We don't prove that we're listening.
So proving that you're listening, that is key. And then from there, everyone sort of is the hope that everyone sort of relaxes a little bit, because it's like, okay, I can see that you're listening to me. And then like I will reciprocate, and reciprocity is something else that you get into as well.
Yeah. This reciprocity is really, really important, because one of the things, the strongest impulse in our brain is the impulse for social reciprocity.
Yeah.
And thank goodness, because this is at the core of prosociality. This is why humans can form tribes and villages and cities, and why we can get together to build aircraft carriers and sometimes have elections. So it's really important. It's really important that we reciprocate what we're seeing in the other person. This is another reason why the matching principle is so valuable.
Yeah.
So if the first skill is I need to learn to ask more questions, particularly deep questions, and the second skill is that I need to show you that I'm listening, prove that I'm listening, then the third skill is that when I hear something meaningful, I need to reply in kind. I need to share something about myself. And this is what's different from journalists, right?
Right.
The nice thing about asking deep questions is, if I ask you, oh, why'd you become a doctor? And you tell me it's because you saw your dad get sick when you were a kid. The most natural thing for me to do then is to answer my own question and say, oh, that's interesting. I became a lawyer because I had an uncle who got arrested when I was a kid, right?
Right.
Now suddenly we're sharing with each other. And this gets to vulnerability, which is really important. And people tend to misunderstand what vulnerability is. They think that it's like crying on each other's shoulder or talking about your mom. That's not vulnerability. Vulnerability is a very specific neural cascade that occurs in our brain when I say something that you might judge. Right. Now, it could be stupid. It could be, I think that Star Wars is better than Star Trek. And you might disagree completely, but I don't really care because it's not that big a deal.
Right.
But the act of me saying something that you could judge, at that point, my brain starts paying attention to how you react. And if instead of judging me, if you share something about yourself that I could judge, we will feel closer to each other. We're actually powerless not to feel closer to each other, not to feel more trusting of each other. Even if we disagree with each other, we voted for different people. If I am a little bit vulnerable with you and you're a little bit vulnerable with me, even on something dumb like what TV shows we like best or what movies we like best, we will feel more connected to each other. So that's the third skill.
You have a chapter titled Every Conversation is a Negotiation. And I read it and I couldn't help but think, So how manipulative is Charles Duhigg? Let's get into this. I would love to know, like, can you just take it away? Like, sort of when you say every conversation is negotiation, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So what I mean is a very specific kind of negotiation. What is known in psychology and academia as a quiet negotiation, where the goal of a quiet negotiation is not to win. It's not to like beat you.
Right.
The goal of a quiet negotiation is to figure out what you want and to share what I want. Right. So if you think about it, like if I ask my wife, yeah, where should we go for dinner tonight? Right? There's this, she says, oh, we should have Indian. And I say maybe Chinese. But there's also this other layer where I'm asking her, like, what do you actually want from dinner? Like, are you looking for something that's like really tasty? Or are you looking just to like hang out and have a nice time? Does ambiance matter more to you than food quality? And so it's a quiet negotiation. Now, I'm not tied up in the answer. I'm not tied up in winning one side. But the act of negotiating determines how we are going to have this conversation, how we share with each other what we want. Even in a conversation we're having,
right?
There's a negotiation going on that, trying to understand, like, from your questions, what are you hoping to draw out of me because you think it's useful to your listeners?
Right.
And on the same way, you're listening to me and you're saying, well, what does Charles really want to get across? What's important to him about this conversation? So it is a negotiation, but it's not a negotiation where I'm trying to beat you. It's a negotiation where I'm trying to understand you.
I love that. You're not making a deal. You're just trying to understand me. And I'm trying to understand you. I also thought while reading this, like, how meta your journey has become when you have conversations now. And like, do you ever have to sort of like stop yourself from thinking about the conversations, or no? Is it just,
it's actually exactly the opposite, because first of all, we make it into habits very quickly, right? So it's, you don't have to sort of think about it. But the second thing is that, if you look at the data, the best conversations that we have are the messiest conversations. Like if you looked at a transcript from a great conversation, and you know this because you look at transcripts all the time.
All the time.
It's a total mess. It's not people giving eloquent speeches and like it reads terribly. People are interrupting each other. We're like going off on tangents while I'm asking you questions that are non sequiturs. So what's happening there? Why are these great questions such a mess? It's because when you're in the middle of a conversation, what matters is not saying the right thing. It's connecting with the other person. There's this quote I love that nobody will remember what you said to them, but they will absolutely remember how you made them feel. And that's so true. That's at the core of how a conversation actually works.
Not the horror.
Right, not the horror, but the core. The core.
Yeah. I would love to have some marching orders from you.
Okay.
Because, so you gave us the example, you did, I love the idea of like no non-starter questions, right?
Right.
Don't ask non-starter questions. Those are kind of boring anyway, but I think so many of us are just sort of, it becomes just rote and it's like habit to ask, like, like, where are you from? What do you do?
Where'd you grow up?
Yes. Right. Where'd you grow up?
So here's the first marching order. It's okay to ask those questions. But when you say to someone, where'd you grow up? And they say Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is where I grew up, to say, oh, what was it like growing up in Albuquerque? Because I've visited there once and it's a really interesting city. What was it like for you? Like, what was the best part of growing up in Albuquerque? Right? That's a deep question.
What was the best part about growing up in Albuquerque?
I want to know. The best part of growing up in Albuquerque was that like I was a big fish in a small pond. It gave me like the biggest confidence boost in the world.
Like Walter White.
Like Walter White, exactly, just like Walter White. But think about how much I just told you about myself, right? That like I'm someone who likes to be a big fish in a small pond. That I'm someone who's probably social, that I'm someone who left Albuquerque and felt like a small fish in a big pond. There's so much to plumb there simply by asking that deep question, that why question, that question, instead of telling me the facts of your life, tell me how you feel about your life. So that's my first marching order, is that tomorrow, everyone listening should go ask one deep question and just see how it goes. And by the end of the week, it'll be a habit.
Okay, that's a great marching order. Number two, do you have a number two? I would love to have like three marching orders. Okay.
Sure. Marching order number two is practice active listening. Practice asking someone a question, listening to their response, repeating back to them what you heard them say, or asking a follow-up question, and then asking if you got it right. These 3 steps of looping for understanding. Because what you'll find is that you think it's going to be really awkward and hard, but that once you start doing it, it's actually totally natural.
So what I should do is repeat what you just said to me, because I was actively listening. But in the interest of time, I won't do that.
Oh, right. But you got to do step 3. You have to ask me if you got it right.
Oh, no, that's right. Okay, actively listening. I am listening. I'm going to repeat back the thing that you said to me about listening. And then I want to know if I got it right. Which
That's exactly right.
Oh, yeah,
you did
right.
it perfectly. Okay. You did it perfectly.
Great. Thank you. and then yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Marching order number 3 is just pay attention to what kind of conversation is happening. Like, as you're listening to someone talk, just ask yourself in the back of your head, does it seem like this is a practical conversation, an emotional conversation, or a social conversation? And wherever it is, go there with them. You know, one of the interesting things is that there was this study done by Harvard, the Harvard study of adult development, where they found that the only thing that accurately predicted whether you're happy and healthy and successful at age 65 was having at least a handful of close relationships at age 45.
Oh, you're talking about Bob Waldinger's work.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Yes, we had him on the show. Love that
wonderful.
Guy. Yes.
Wonderful. He's fantastic, right? So I'm sure that he emphasizes too. Connecting with other people is really, really important.
That's what it's all about.
And how do we connect with other people? We practice it. We have conversations. If you haven't talked to someone in 6 months, a friend of yours, just give them a call. Set aside 45 minutes to chat. And you know what? The first 3 or 4 minutes will be awkward because you probably forgot their kid's name and you forgot how old they are. But after 3 or 4 minutes, it's going to be wonderful and you're going to feel so much more connected to each other.
Absolutely.
So this is the 3rd marching order, is pay attention to what kinds of conversations are happening and just go have them. Practice them. Don't let one moment of awkwardness dissuade you from having a long conversation that makes you feel wonderful.
I love it. It's totally worth the awkwardness anyway. It usually is.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
How does one sort of assess if they're getting better at super communicating? Is there a metric for this?
Well, I think the first thing is everyone is a super communicator at one time or another, right? And so if your goal is to become more of a consistent super communicator, then I think the metric is to ask yourself, is this feeling easier? Like, look, it's totally natural to have anxiety about conversations. And in fact, if you ask the best communicators if they were always good at communication, they'll tell you no. They'll say, when I was a kid in high school, I had trouble making friends with other kids. And so I really had to study how they talk to each other. Or my parents got divorced and I had to be the peacemaker between them. Being concerned, being anxious about a conversation does not mean you're bad at it. But once you practice these techniques, once you get better at it, the metric is, at the end of the week, if you look back and you say like, gosh, like all those conversations went a lot better than I thought they were going to go, or that I worried that they were going to go. That's the metric that matters most. Like, if you feel like you can have conversations with the people you want to have conversations with, that's the only metric that matters, because you don't have to have any conversations you don't want to have.
Right.
But it's really nice to be able to connect with someone when I want to connect with them.
Love that. Great note to end on.